Today I'm going to be taking a look at the newest release from Baltic. It is a very dressy watch. It has a cool micro rotor in it, and I think it's at a pretty fair price, so let's take a look at it. So we have a diameter of 36 millimeters, lug to lug of 43.7, height of 10.3, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch: we're going to have the Hangzhou caliber 5000A micro rotor movement beating away in here. Not many companies have used this movement yet, and it's pretty cool. Obviously it's a micro rotor, it helps the watch be very thin, and it's pretty well decorated, or at least looks very nice considering the price point. The watch also comes with a domed Hesalite crystal on the front. I believe Hesalite's used on the back too. It might be sapphire, but they just don't say on the website. They also don't state what the water resistance is of the watch, which I assume is probably around 30 meters or less, just because it is a dressier watch with a non-screw down crown. Other than that, this watch retails for 551.67 euros directly from Baltic, and that's without VAT, and $631 give or take when converted to US. So moving on to the dial of this watch, and I think it's really well done here. We obviously have this very classic dress watch style layout, brigade numerals everywhere. For the kind of 7 and 8 o'clock marker, it's taken over by that sub-second style, and then the classic leaf style handset. It is really a gorgeous looking watch, and I do like the tones of gray that are used. It's very color neutral, it's very almost modern in a sense, and I think it just looks great. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have this kind of outside railroad track that has every 5-minute marker in there. It also matches pretty well tonally with how just kind of the brigade numerals change around in the light. So often they have the same kind of grayish tone to them, and I think that's a pretty cool detail. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's something I noticed. There's basically no text on this watch here. We just have Baltic written there around the 12 o'clock. One thing I will say about the Baltic text is that I feel that it's not only a little bit small, but it's a little bit low. I would have preferred to see it at least a little bit higher and a little bit bigger, and I think the watch would have been better for it. The actual base dial texture itself is very fine. It's almost like somewhat of a leather pebbled grain, or if you took a piece of like tin foil and wrapped it up in that kind of wavy pattern that emerges from just crumpling it. It is a really cool effect. It gives a little bit more visual interest to the watch rather than just a plain colored dial. And it's nice that you have a little bit of breakup in that texture with the sub-seconds track, which is more of a concentric circle done very, very finely. Overall, very nicely done dial, very clean. There isn't really much I think Baltic didn't do well here. Again, I think the text could be a little bit more better implemented, a little bit larger. But other than that, it's a very clean looking dial. It catches the light very nicely. I think the proportions of the numerals are very cool, and it looks like a very nicely made dress watch, especially considering it is at that smaller size. So zooming in here, we do see that very interesting fine, again, kind of almost leather grain, liquid metallic look of the dial texture. Very nicely done, and again, it gives a little bit of interest to the watch. It's also nice that it's not necessarily a cohesive, repeating, strict pattern. It's a little bit more abstract, and I guess adds to just how unique the texture looks. The Baltic text itself done really nicely, no real blemishes there. Looking at the numerals themselves, they are a little bit dirty, I guess you can say. This is a $600 watch, and you don't really expect perfection at this price point. And for what it is, I've never really noticed how quote-unquote dirty these are in direct light or from the wrist view. But going up close, you can see there is a little bit of speckling on the numerals there. Same goes for the 11, 10 o'clock marker, tiny little speckling. But you know, it is what it is. They aren't all like that. The 9 o'clock is a little bit more perfect, but even then you see there is a little bit of like dimpling in the texture itself, which isn't bad. And again, I've never noticed that without zooming in this close. Looking at the outer railroad minute track, we do see it is very nicely, finely, circularly brushed. A nice color depth to it, that gray contrasting. Sometimes it looks darker, sometimes it looks lighter depending on the angle. And it's really nice that it's not just a flat color. It has a little bit more of a living nature to it. One thing I would have liked to see is the numerals out in the railroad track kind of mirror the brigade numerals a little bit closer. I think it would have just looked fun, another extra little detail, and you know, couldn't have hurt too much, right? Looking at the seconds track here, again, it is a differing texture from the rest of the dial. It does have that concentric circle pattern. It's not as deep as you kind of would expect, or I guess I would have liked to see, because then it would have stood out a little bit more on the watch. But even then, the printing is done well, and the subtle texture isn't done too shabbily either. Looking at the hands themselves, as you can see, they are double faceted. There is a little bit of imperfection along the base hour hand there, or the base minute hand rather, at the very edge. It is nice to see a center pinion cap, a nice little detail that you don't see on many watches, especially at this price point. And the hands themselves are actually fairly well done. There aren't really any major blemishes on them. They catch the light really nicely. They are nicely faceted. And they didn't go for the classic one-half polished, one-half brushed look that a lot of watches do. And I think that's a benefit. I think it looks really nice when both sides of the hands can capture the light. And then really quickly, you can see at the base of the minute hand there is a little bit of a scratch or possibly a fiber. And the same story goes for near the end there on the left-hand side, that little tiny speck that's somewhat hard to capture, but I'm sure you can see it. Overall, really nicely done dial. The elements are executed very well. I think at the price point of these small little QC issues are mainly forgivable, and it really is a very nicely done dial that I think holds up pretty well under macro. Looking at the case here, and it's nothing that you really haven't seen before from Baltic. It has that same DNA of the relatively short, thick lugs, the very highly polished and flat bezel. And what's nice is they do go for a fairly thin and ergonomic case shape, drilled lug holes. But again, it is one of those cases where you either love it or hate it. For me, it is very blocky, and I personally don't overly love how it wears, but I do think because they've sized down to 36 millimeters, it is one of their best wearing cases and best so far in terms of harmony with their usual case design. Looking a little bit more generally, we do again have all highly polished surfaces on the very top portion. Going to the side, we do have the brushing horizontally with a all high polished crown, nothing special there. Case back, no writing, but we do have again the very cool micro rotor movement on display that we'll take a look at a little bit more later. It is a very nice case overall. Again, it is very blocky, it is very prominent, and I think it wears larger than its 36 millimeter case would suggest it does. Looking at it a little bit more closely from the side, because we have a fairly thin mid case with a highly polished bezel and case back, it does help to even visually thin out the mid case even more. And this is a really thin watch to begin with, so although it doesn't necessarily need that, it is a welcome little design addition. What's nice is because the watch is so thin, again, just about around 10 millimeters with the crystal, it wears amazingly well. It fits really closely on the wrist, and it plants itself very nicely. And that is something I think that is even more emphasized because of the 20 millimeter lugs. Had they have gone for something like 18 millimeters, it would have felt a little bit more dainty, but the 20 millimeter still gives it a very nice and purposeful stance. Taking the strap off just so you can see it a little bit better. The inside of the lugs are actually fully brushed, which is nice, and there is a little bit of a writing. It says Baltic Micro Rotor Automatic Movement Stainless Steel, and on the opposite side there is a serial number only for the first 200 models. But I think it is a little bit of a cool touch. It is almost a little bit of a callback to those vintage Rolex where they do have the numbers in between them. I think modern ones still do that, but anyway, digressing. So looking at the movement really quickly, we do see it's a very cool looking micro rotor. It hasn't been used by many brands yet. I think Solas was one of the first that started using this movement, and now because it's kind of such a hit with Baltic, I'm sure more are gonna jump on the train. One thing I didn't mention is the kind of stated accuracy for this movement is supposed to be plus or minus 20 seconds, which is kind of standard compared to most things. But my model's about at plus 2.5 seconds, which is really good. I wouldn't say that your model's going to be around there, but at least mine is performing pretty well. But a little bit more generally, we do have a lot of cool looking elements. We have striping, we have the micro rotor, we have some perlage, we have a lot of gears on display. Some nice gold text there, and not heat blued, but painted blue screws. So let's kind of look closer and just see what this movement's all about. Looking at the movement a little bit more, the Baltic watch is engraved there into the micro rotor with this really nice kind of spiraled engraved texture to it, really well done. A little bit of perlaging on the main base plate there, or the base plate below. There is a fair amount of depth there in the actual striping of the bridges. There is a little bit of dirtiness along parts of the striping, but I think that can be forgiven because this is such a thin movement and a micro rotor at a fairly affordable price point. Looking there at the painted blued screws, of course some of them differ a little bit in tone, but it does add a nice little color matching along with the kind of synthetic red of the rubies. One thing I really like about this movement is how much depth you get to see for such a relatively thin movement. There's a lot of screws on display. You get to see a bunch of the cogs and wheels turning. You actually get to see the balance spring unwinding and the pallet fork beating away there beneath it, and this little gear turning. So there's a lot of fun to be had, and I think for the price point, it's pretty exceptional what you can get. Moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing my little quartz Creedor here. And here we have the Baltic on my 6.5 inch wrist. And as you can tell, it wears really well. Again, it's not very long in lug to lug, it's very thin, and the 36mm case obviously looks great. It's a very well proportioned watch. And I think the dial elements play really well into that, obviously minus the logo, but it's all very well executed. Again, sits really closely to the wrist, sits very comfortably. There's no edges that dig at all. The crown isn't overly sized to where it actually hurts the wrist or anything. I do think it's slightly undersized in terms of winding and operation. They could have made it just slightly bigger because it is very thin and a little bit hard to manipulate. But besides that, it does wear really well. It is very comfortable. Something I think you can notice, especially if I make it shine less because of the highly reflective surfaces, it does have that very blocky stance to it, which a lot of people I think will like because it's such a small watch. If you're not used to 36mm and maybe 38 or 40 has always been your lower limit, this will wear a little bit larger than you would expect it to. And looking at it from the side there, nothing you wouldn't expect. Conforms really well. It's already a thin watch, but thankfully they didn't do anything that went against the innate ergonomics of the micro rotor. So wears comfortably. I like how it fits. I like how it wears. A little bit blocky, but if you don't mind that, or if you actually prefer that, go ahead. The case I could compare this watch to is the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical. That one is a little bit larger at 38mm, but they have a very similar feel about them. This one ends up feeling a little bit flatter just because of that completely flat bezel, but that gives you a kind of starting point to how this could wear. So moving on to some other straps, I did want to mention this one that I had it on was a nice Fluco Suede gray strap. The strap that the watch actually comes with, at least the version I picked, was this nice green one with quick release bars. It's a little bit weird. It ends in this very weird square end. It does taper nicely. It's very thin and not the highest quality of strap. The color depth of the leather is really nice, and it's cool that they color matched it, the stitching, but it really isn't the highest quality leather. It's serviceable and it has like a nice little Baltic clasp, but I would say at the end, look into getting another strap for this watch because it deserves a higher quality strap. An actual good green strap from, again, Fluco, one of their suede models. Very nice dark green, again with the matching stitching, very much along the lines of this strap, just done a little bit better and more comfortably, and I think for cheaper. I think the green really brings out a nice fun color to the overall gray, very monotone watch. What's nice is because the watch is fairly color neutral with all the gray tones, you can have a lot of fun and just pick really colorful, outrageous straps. Making the watch a little bit more serious, we have this nice natural Botero strap from King Leathercraft. I think it pairs with the watch very beautifully. And yeah, let's get it on wrist. This is a strap that I believe only tapers by about 2mm. And I think with this strap on the watch in particular, you can kind of tell it does have a very large stance on wrist because of that 20mm lug width. And it's by no means bad. I think it looks cool. It definitely will help those with larger wrists get used to this sizing, and not too badly done. Here we have a nice distressed Italian leather from Vario. The blue plays really nicely with the gray tones. The strap does taper from 20 to 16mm, so you're going to see a little bit of like the opposite of what the previous King Leathercraft strap did and how overall more aggressive the stance was. Here we have it on wrist. Again, a little bit more of a taper, so a little bit more of a classy appearance to it, I think. The distressed leather, though, of course, still dresses it down. Fun little color pop to the watch, and overall, pretty nice strap. And lastly, we have the Archer silicone strap, very white, very bright, and let's get it on wrist. Very fun combo, dresses it down, makes it a little bit less serious. Overall, not too shabby. Taking a quick look at these two watches side by side just because I happen to have them. Of course, on the right we have the Baltic, and on the left we have the Lobini, which is just a random watch I bought off of AliExpress because, or maybe Alibaba, I forget which one. But I bought it because it has that micro rotor movement in it. And this is one of the first watches I saw it in, and then the Baltic came out a little bit later. One thing I will note is, of course, the Baltic does use the blued screws, whereas this one doesn't. The text on the kind of plate there is a little bit different. This is actually written in German, but it still says like adjusted to 5 position. It still says the brand name. It still says caliber 5000. Just a little bit small difference there. But one thing I mainly wanted to point out between the watches is that this uses sapphire, and if you kind of tap on the watch, there's not a huge amount of sound that comes from it. Nothing too crazy, but with the Baltic, if you tap on it a little bit, it's a lot louder. And the same thing goes if you tap on the back. So if you're kind of putting the watch on and off wrist, you're kind of getting that sound. Putting it a little closer to the mic. So again, you're getting a little bit more sound from the Baltic. I don't know if that's because of the Hesalite, if because of the smaller case or whatnot, but that's just something to know. The Lobini comes in at around, I think, $200, whereas the Baltic is $600. So I think it's weird that the Lobini even has a little bit more of a higher quality feel because it's a little bit quieter. But of course the Baltic is better in most areas. I mean, the dial, the actual numerals, I think are better done here, but that is just something I wanted to point out because I had them both and it's something I noticed. So taking a quick look at the Baltic in like natural lighting, you can see that it catches the light really well, the numerals reflect really nicely. I mean, it does just genuinely look like a really nicely made watch, and I think Baltic did a really good job with the dial and just how all the polished elements play against each other. And the movement too does not look too bad. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros is going to be the movement. It is a micro rotor, it looks pretty well decorated, and I think for the price point it's pretty crazy. Whereas most brands are using a Miyota 9015 or a Seiko NH at this price point, honestly, you're getting something that's not only more interesting, looks better, is a little bit more of an oddball in a collection, but I think it's just fun. I believe one of the cheapest micro rotor movements is made, or is going to be made by Orage, or Horage, I don't know really how you say it, but that one I believe is around $6,000. I'll correct it if that's not true, but even then, that's 10 times the price of this watch and proves it's pretty fair value. Another big pro for me is just gonna be the size of the watch. I think at 36 millimeters, they went for the right size. The movement looks very proportional in the case. It just fits well on wrist. It looks nice, and because they went for such a extremely dressy aesthetic, the sizing fits perfectly well with that. And lastly, I just think the dial is pretty well executed. The numerals look amazing. The polish is very nicely done. All the elements just come together really nicely. The texture, the color, the railroad's minute track. It all is executed very well, and I think it really is a good watch to look at. Now moving on to cons, and I think one of the bigger cons for me is the fact that the case is a little bit blocky. Again, I compared it a little bit to the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical, and that's another watch that I ended up not keeping because of the blocky feel of the case. It ended up making that 38 millimeter not wearing like a 38. It made it wear larger, and I didn't like how it felt on wrist. And although that's not completely the case here with the 36 millimeter, 36 wearing larger is still a very nice size. It's just that it's not completely a design I mesh well with. Another con for me is the Baltic logo on the face of the watch. It is a little small, it's a little bit low on the dial, and I think because so many of the elements on the dial are large, it has a large sub-seconds, it has some large numerals on it. The very small, dainty Baltic logo is a little bit at odds with the rest of the design. My last con is going to just be the loudness of the movement itself, not necessarily within the micro rotor, but more in, I guess, day-to-day operation of taking it on and off and maybe moving your wrist around a little bit. I don't know if it's because of how thin the case is or because it uses a Hesalite crystal, but if you kind of tap on the glass or you put the watch on and off, you do hear a somewhat loud thud. And I really don't know what's causing it, but it's not the nicest noise to hear. And I did show you with the cheaper micro rotor movement that I do have, same exact movement, doesn't make the same exact sound. I do think it might be down to the crystal, but either way, not the most high quality feel from the watch. So something I just had to mention. Overall, final thoughts on the watch, and I think it is a pretty fantastic option. If you're into smaller watches, this is totally gonna be right up your alley. It is awesome. It's nice to see an offering at this size. It's nice to see a micro rotor movement being used nonetheless. It's nice to see brigade numerals being used. It's nice to see everything, right? Baltic definitely did well with this release. Again, as I mentioned at some point, this is, I think, their most effective use of their traditional Baltic case style with the thicker lugs and the thin flat bezel, or thick flat bezel, really. It just feels more right at the smaller size because, again, those design elements usually end up making the watch wear larger. And I think because the watch is so small, it just works. For under $1,000, you're just really getting a lot of value here. And I think at the end of the day, it's nice because this watch, if you choose to get one, if you're even interested in one, will stand out in a lot of ways from what's already in your watch box. It may be your only dress watch. It will definitely probably be your only micro rotor watch. It's fairly thin. It's just pretty well executed in most areas. I do think you should change the strap out, but that being such a minor issue, I think it's a non-issue. If you're even passingly interested in this watch, I think you should give it a try. It might introduce you to how cool smaller watches are, it might introduce you to how cool dress watches are, or it just might be a cool, fun watch to wear every now and then. Either way, I really had fun in kind of wearing this Baltic, reviewing it, taking a look at it. Hope you got something out of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another one.